the mighty and resilient Merrimack River, carving through the communities of our great region. My name is Linda Lorden, proud president of Merrimack County Savings Bank, and like the river that serves as our namesake, we're a constant yet ever-changing presence. Because to us, it's bigger than banking. It's about powering communities and putting people first. It's about knowing where you came from and where you're going. That's Merrimack style. Visit us at themerrimack.com.
History as it happens, July 30th, 2024. What is economic nationalism?
We cannot and will not let this continue. Less than 4 years ago, we were a great nation, and we will soon be a great nation again. We're going to be a great nation again.
The lack of good jobs, of course, led to stagnant wages. And then the Democrats flooded this country with millions of illegal aliens. So citizens had to compete with people who shouldn't even be here for precious housing.
Raise tariffs, expel immigrants, and build factories for Made in the USA. These ideas make up a major part of the Trump-Vance economic platform. America First is economic nationalism, and the ideas are as old as the Republic. But will they work in our globalized economy? That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Well, it's the notion that the tools of the government, the tools of the state, can be employed for strategic direction of the economy. And that is everything from fostering and supporting certain industries that they view as either military value or industrial value, or have a variety of reasons that they'll offer behind that. And then also, they try to orient economic activity toward American businesses and American interests. The belief that we're in a zero-sum competition with the rest of the world, and therefore the government should advance America first, if not outright penalize other countries. Basically treats other countries as if they're singular economic units that we're in competition with, and policy should be done in such a way that promotes our units and attacks or penalizes or denigrates some of our viewed competitors. You know, that today that's China. A couple decades ago, it was viewed as Japan was the major competitor. A century ago, it was viewed as Britain was the major competitor.
In an interview with CBS's Face the Nation in early 1992, Pat Buchanan tried to explain his economic platform as he was challenging the incumbent Republican President George Bush for the party's nomination. This may sound more than a little familiar.
Bob, we are losing industries like autos and steel. We have lost TVs, VCRs, radio. The Japanese are putting under assault supercomputers, flat panel technology. They are challenging our aircraft industry. Where is the administration plan to make America first again in manufacturing by the year 2000? It was utterly absent. I think you need an entire restructuring of the tax code, and you've got to downsize government. A 90-day moratorium on regulations, when Mr. Bush has imposed more than any other president, is Mickey Mouse. It is not dramatic enough, it is not deep enough, and I don't think it's going to satisfy folks up in New Hampshire who have been in a depression for some 3 years now.
And those were the pre-NAFTA days. Buchanan was a free trade skeptic who, like Trump today, accused the Washington establishment of forsaking the working class. Well, more than 30 years later, there's plenty of grievance out there, often directed at the globalization that seemed to hold so much promise as the curtain came down on the Cold War. Just last week, a Harvard study on incomes found that the white working class has seen its economic opportunities shrink. As the New York Times reported, the situation might have played out like this. Over the past few decades, globalization and changes in technology have caused many jobs to go from the United States to China, India, and elsewhere. These shifts appear to have pushed white people out of the workforce, while black people found other jobs. The report on the Harvard study goes on to say there are several explanations for the racial disparity. The report on the Harvard study goes on to say there are several explanations for the racial disparity. White workers might have had more wealth or savings to weather unemployment than their black counterparts did, but at a cost to their upward mobility. They might also have been less willing to find another job. A steel mill that shut down could have employed not just one worker, but his father and grandfather, making it a family occupation. People in that situation, in that community, might feel that they lost something more than a job. It might not settle for any other work. Again, that is according to the New York Times report on that Harvard study on incomes. At the Republican National Convention, Donald Trump and his running mate, J.D. Vance, vowed to reverse what they see are the ills of globalization, or what some call neoliberalism. Here are some of their comments.
Today, our cities are flooded with illegal aliens. Americans are being squeezed out of the labor force and their jobs are taken. And by the way, you know who's taking the jobs that are created? 107% of those jobs are taken by illegal aliens. And you know who's being hurt the most by millions of people pouring into our country? The black population and the Hispanic population, because they're taking the jobs from our black population, our Hispanic population, and they're also taking them from unions.
We're going to build factories again, put people to work making real products for American families made with the hands of American workers. Together, we will protect the wages of American workers and stop the Chinese Communist Party from building their middle class on the backs of American citizens.
They're building some of the largest auto plants anywhere in the world. Think of it, in the world. We're going to bring it back. We're going to make them. We don't mind that happening, but those plants are going to be built in the United States, and our people are going to man those plants. And if they don't agree with us, we'll put a tariff of approximately 100 to 200% on each car, and they will be unsellable in the United States.
Trump was referring there to Chinese auto plants being built in Mexico. He does not want Chinese EV imports entering the United States. So if we set aside the boasting and really the nonsensical claims in those speeches, we can find three main points in their economic program: tariffs, expelling immigrants, and made in the USA, building more factories here. So while tariffs may seem like a new idea or one that Donald Trump brought out of dormancy to wield against China, tariffs were once the mainstay of U.S. economic policy. They provided the lion's share of federal revenues for much of the 19th and first half of the 20th centuries. Tariffs were a centerpiece of Henry Clay's American system. But they were always contested in the political arena because tariffs had drawbacks. There were always free traders alongside of the protectionists. Tariffs actually have a fascinating history. Yes, tariffs and trade. Phil Magness is a senior fellow at the Independent Institute and the David J. Thoreau Chair in Political Economy. Welcome back to the show, Phil Magness.
Thanks for having me.
It's been about a year and a half. You were on the first time to talk about the 1619 Project's Hulu docuseries.
Right.
I really enjoyed that conversation, but I'm also happy that I haven't had to go back and do another show about the 1619 Project since. So, well, we're going to talk about an old debate here, tariffs. But just on a personal note, you have a new position. You're at the Independent Institute now, which is based in California. You're studying or doing research on political economy. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I joined the Independent Institute in January. We're in the David J. Thoreau Chair in Political Economy, and basically conduct research on free market ideas, economic history, and a variety of topics that relate to both public policy and economic applications in the world.
You're a historian, but you also come at this from a more libertarian perspective. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's a libertarian, free market. I'm very much in the classical liberal economic tradition.
Well, sometimes when people tell me the United States was founded on free markets, I say, well, what about tariffs?
Right.
We'll get to that. We're going to get to and try to cover a couple centuries of tariff policy in a short podcast. I have to be selective. But first, the reason I'm talking to you about this is because President Trump and his vice presidential pick, J.D. Vance, have an economic platform that I describe as economic nationalism. So what does that mean? Right. How do you define economic nationalism?
Well, it's the notion that the tools of the government, the tools of the state, can be employed for strategic direction of the economy. And that is everything from fostering and supporting certain industries that they view as of either military value or industrial value, or have a variety of reasons that they'll offer behind that. And then also they try to orient economic activity toward American businesses and American interests. The belief that we're in a zero-sum competition with the rest of the world, and therefore the government should advance America first, if not outright penalize other countries. Basically treats other countries as if they're singular economic units that we're in competition with, and policy should be done in such a way that promotes our units and attacks or penalizes or denigrates some of our viewed competitors. And that today that's China. A couple decades ago it was viewed as Japan was the major competitor. A century ago it was viewed as Britain was the major competitor.
Pat Buchanan, when he announced his run for the White House in December 1991 in New Hampshire, if you go back and listen to that speech, and I've done so many times for previous podcasts, he talks about Japan. You can just substitute China now to modernize or make that speech current.
The rising economic power of Japan has filed a claim to displace the United States as the great power of the 21st century.
Would you say economic nationalism is an attempt at autarky or not? Because, who could really have an autarkic economy, if that's even a term, economy today? We're all interconnected anyway, but...
Yeah, it's all a matter of degree. So autarky, the notion that we can be completely self-sufficient, cut ourselves off from the world, almost like North Korea style, and produce everything internally. The interesting thing there is that the United States is a much larger geographic area and has a much more diverse internal industry. So there are some on the very extreme end of protectionism and economic nationalism that probably would say come pretty close to autarky. Although I think practically speaking, that would be such an economic disruption to the United States that it'd be politically infeasible.
I also see economic nationalism, or the most important word of the two is nationalism. It seems to rise at certain points in history. If you look at interwar Europe, right? It's a set of policies like tariffs, but also attitudes or an ideology about the world, turning in away from an open and interconnected world that emerged after the end of the Cold War. Do you think there's something to that argument?
Well, there's absolutely that trend going on, and it's why you see a lot of the economic nationalists, the people that are calling for tariffs. They're also calling for the most severe immigration restrictions. They're also calling for a foreign policy that actually veers fairly close to an isolationist direction, and sometimes. I say that as someone who is very much in favor of foreign policy restraint myself. I don't think we should be going in adventurism across the world, but I think there's another element that even pushes that further to we should completely withdraw from international affairs.
We are going to get to the history here, but J.D. Vance, he gave an interview to the New York Times recently. This is before he became the vice presidential pick, about his economic outlook. So he says, the main thrust of the post-war American order of globalization, because we're going to be talking about globalization too, has involved relying more and more on cheaper labor. The trade issue and the immigration issue are two sides of the same coin, he said. The trade issue is cheaper labor overseas, and the immigration issue is cheaper labor at home, which applies upward pressure on a whole host of services, he says, from hospital services to housing and so forth. The populist vision, at least as it exists in my head, is an inversion of that, applying as much upward pressure on wages and as much downward pressure on the services that people use as possible. That sounds like deflationary policy. He said he wants to raise the minimum wage, hypothetically, to $20 an hour. He says, what is not good is you replace a McDonald's worker from Middletown, Ohio, who makes $17 an hour, with an immigrant who makes $15 an hour. He wants, to be a higher minimum wage, but for those jobs to go to Americans, not immigrants.
Vance, unfortunately, you look at a lot of the rhetoric that's coming out of it, it actually sounds like something that was pretty strongly associated with the political left for the better part of the last century. J.D. Vance and Bernie Sanders are not far apart economically. They're calling for a lot of the same things, that is restriction of international trade, pro-labor policies that are supposed to bolster up American workers, but they also have kind of this anti-immigrant flavor to them, and this supposed withdrawal from globalization or international engagement. Both of them seem to view the economy as like the zero-sum game to gather up as much of the wealth as we can, and noting that wealth is like a fixed good, it's a scarce asset. We should try to direct policy in such a way that gets the majority of it to the United States, and that necessitates using the tools of the government to have a very top-down conscious design of the American economy. So again, this is something that fits very naturally with like the socialist central planners of the left, but here we have a right-wing spin on it. It's the exact same tools, they just direct it in a slightly different area. And I look at something like this, and I think they're actually living in something of a utopian fantasy land, disconnected from economic reality. Because you hear J.D. Vance talking about like as if we have this massive unemployment problem. Unemployment has been sitting around like 3% basically since we've had the recovery from the COVID pandemic. It's not in cue with economic reality as it exists on the ground. It's kind of like this mythical vision of the United States in decline, which again very closely fits with his populist and nationalist rhetoric. But if you look at the stats, you look at the data, they just simply don't align with the claims that he's making.
Based on what I've read, I'm not sure that the problems that we've seen in parts of this country, the Rust Belt, it's become a cliche now, white working class or poor whites, that the answer is McDonald's jobs. I think part of the problem is how globalization tore at the fabric of these communities. So if your grandfather or father worked at the steel mill, that was part of the family lineage. You can't work at the steel mill anymore. It's moved overseas or whatever. So, I mean, we hear a lot, too, about the deaths of despair and the depression, not just economic depression, but social paralysis or depression in these parts of the country. Again, it's kind of a generalization. It's kind of become a cliche, but I think there is some truth to that, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, there are cultural elements to his argument. And I think here economics has become the scapegoat for what are oftentimes very real cultural problems. Yes, we do have drug abuse problems. We do have deaths of despair. We do have substance abuse that runs amok and was actually exacerbated in significant ways by COVID-19 and the lockdowns. These are very real things that exist, but then someone like J.D. Vance will turn around and says, aha, this is because of globalization that's the cause behind it. That's kind of a misplaced diagnosis. It's the same thing with the nostalgia for working in the steel mill. They'll tell a story as if like the steel mill is the centerpiece of social activity in a town and people that are multiple generations working there. But if you ask, young people today, very, very few people have a dream job of working in a steel mill. The whole notion is upward mobility means you could better yourself. You could escape the job that your grandfather or your great-grandfather had to work in because it was the only thing available at that time.
I do think one legitimate critique of the free trade regime post-1991, if we just date this, end of the Cold War, is that as jobs were moved overseas, factories, whatever, that our country didn't do enough to replace that with job training, modern job training for these communities.
And there you see some of the issues that are coming to bear with higher education. I think as higher education became politicized and moved into a direction of like fomenting activism, moving away from training, moving away from skill development, yes, you do have kind of an underinvestment in the most practical aspects. And instead, academia has been like flush with cash to promote gender studies degrees and all these fashionable things that are popular among elites. So you do get some cultural resentment there. It's kind of like, hey, the education system's leaving us behind, or it's not doing anything that's going to service my skills or my children's skills in a changing economy in such a way that we can actually get better jobs and better careers.
Or people who do have degrees are now weighed down by an enormous amount of debt, and then their first starting salary isn't all that great. But, what Vance and his ilk might say is, we're proposing certain policy choices that need to be made. They might say, that the idea of a globalized economy and a globalized world, the end of history, market economics and democracy were on the march. That just wasn't a natural development. They would say that was also a choice. They would say that was a choice as well. We made policy decisions like welcoming China into the WTO. NAFTA was a choice. And I'm not sure if you've read Nelson Lichtenstein, who's on the left. He's a labor historian. His book, A Fabulous Failure, has a lot of good information in there about these trends underway in the 1990s. Walmart moved so much of its factories overseas, especially to China. I guess what I'm getting at is they would say that those were all choices, and there have been drawbacks to those choices that we're not facing up to.
Yeah, I think every choice has a trade-off, but what I'd point out is as basically in the post-World War II era, the trajectory has been toward a more globalized, liberalized international trade system. And it's been an almost uninterrupted trajectory in that sense. And yes, that's a choice, but there's a reason we made that choice. And the reason is that we tried the approach that J.D. Vance and some of these nationalists and economic protectionists desire for several decades prior to that. And it ended in disaster. It ended in the Great Depression. We had a high tariff regime throughout the 1920s that was hiked at the outset of the Great Depression, and it plunged the world into basically global ruination.
Smoot-Hawley, one of
Exactly.
Herbert Hoover's many failures not to veto that bill. And also just recently, tariffs, the Trump administration's tariffs. What's your verdict on his use of tariffs? He claims that, I guess he doesn't say that this is really a tax.
Yeah.
There's actually a steep cost to consumers to these tariffs, weren't there? Which I must say are still in place. The Biden administration has not gotten rid of them.
The thing to recognize with a tariff is it's not a policy that can be implemented that has just uniform good that comes out of it. When you impose a tariff, you are raising the price on consumer goods. And that burden tends to fall upon the public in general. Anyone that buys something, you purchase a toaster oven, a cell phone, a new automobile, if it has components in it that are subject to a tariff, you're bearing some of the pass-through effects of that. And this is something where I think Trump doesn't really understand the economics of tariffs and protectionism all that much. He thinks, hey, I'm putting a tax on China, therefore China is going to pay the tax.
Yeah,
An economist would say, no, that's actually not the case because tax incidence shifts from tariffs onto other groups, and the main one that bears it's American consumers. So it's like putting a tax on a country abroad. The effect all boomerangs back around to us, and we end up paying for it.
So do you agree then with some of the early studies that have come out looking at the Trump tariffs that they were not a very effective way of doing things?
Generally so. It seems to be the case that he thought he had a major foreign policy lever to play, and it turns out to be a very minor economic lever on China, but a cost that is paid back by American consumers in general.
Yeah, he used it as a means to an end.
Right,
He sees himself as a deal maker. Well, we're going to get to the history now, and the segue to that is, I always thought with my fairly tenuous grasp of economics that when you're the world's superpower economically, you don't want economic nationalism to be your policy. That's for countries that are trying to catch up to the behemoth. So, late 18th century, early United States. Tariffs were there from the very beginning. You wrote this excellent essay. I'll share a link to the essay in my weekly newsletter. You wrote it for the Cato Institute about the history of tariffs in the United States. James Madison, was he the first one? He proposed a tariff on
the very first tariff.
Yeah, on the floor of the Congress, the very first Congress. What was his aim? Was it revenues or protectionism?
So Madison followed out of the Constitutional Convention. The major problem of the Articles of Confederation is there was no national tax system. And then when they come together in Philadelphia in 1787 to draft the Constitution, the most important clause, and Madison basically identifies it as such, is to give a national tax power to collect impost duties and excises, basically to fund the federal government of the United States. And of that, one of those powers was envisioned to be a tax on goods coming into the U.S., the impost. So Madison is elected to the first Congress in 1789, and he writes the original impost bill. And it's basically a one-page bill that has a blank in there. It says that goods that are imported into the United States will be taxed at blank percent. And then they had a small debate, and like the next speaker proposes, well, maybe we should put 5%. That seems like a reasonable revenue generating mechanism here. But the whole purpose behind this bill was to fund the government by taxing goods that are coming across the border.
Protectionism was incidental to that.
Entirely, although Madison's kind of taken off guard. Remember in the Federalist Papers, he makes this beautiful argument about how we need to constrain the problem of the faction, the interest group. We need to prevent any one small secular interest from taking over the mechanisms of government and using it to its own advantage. And we do that through checks and balances in this elaborate legislative process. Well, Madison gets caught off guard because he proposes this very simple bill that is strictly for like revenue purposes. And then there's a congressman congressman from Pennsylvania who stands up and says, okay, you can tax everything at 5%, but I have this industry I want to help protect from British competition in my district. Maybe you can tax it at 10%. That way my constituents get the benefit.
Yeah, there you go.
So interest groups creep in incidentally and completely unintentional by Madison. Like he's writing letters to his wife saying that the tariff bill has been derailed in this horrible debate that's taken me off guard, and we're not even sure we're going to get a revenue measure through because all the special interests are already descending on Congress.
K Street of the 18th century. In those
Absolutely.
days, there was no K Street in Washington. Well, they weren't even in Washington in the first Congress. We should talk a little bit big picture context here. Great Britain. Great Britain was, well, it's often thought of as, well, a trading empire. It was a maritime power. But was Great Britain practicing mercantilism, or how would you describe the economic system? Because it was unfair. It was unfair to the colonies, right?
Yeah, in that era, it is absolutely a mercantile empire. This is one of the major grievances of the Declaration of Independence. The Americans are saying King George has cut off our trade with the rest of the world. He says that we can only buy English goods. We can't go to the Caribbean. We can't go to other powers to trade with them because England is trying to direct the trajectory of its trade into and out of different places around the empire. England and its vast commercial reaches are heavily managed by regulatory principles, by tariffs, by navigation laws that require goods to travel on certain flagships and only to go to certain ports. So basically, that's part of what the United States was rebelling against, was the effect of that.
At this time, the United States really has no industry at all. Great Britain was an industrializing power. This is the Industrial Revolution, but we had no industry. I mean, we couldn't even manufacture enough weapons in the Revolutionary War. We were helped by France and others. So Alexander Hamilton, though, he wanted to change that. He wanted the United States to develop its own industries. And you mentioned him in your essay that he was a protectionist to a point.
Absolutely. So Hamilton, of all the major founding fathers, he's the only one that outright subscribes to protectionism across his entire career. Jefferson's a free trader, Madison's a free trader, George Washington, John Jay, they're generally conducive to free trade. But in 1791, Hamilton's Secretary of the Treasury, which has the overview of administering the tariff system, the customs houses, he sends a report to Congress basically laying out an argument for revising the tariff schedule upward. And he says, we could adopt basically an 18th century industrial policy. There are certain industries we strategically want to cultivate, like iron production, iron manufacturing. A lot of them have military value. And he says, we should cultivate these industries through policies that are designed to promote them and protect them from competition abroad. So he proposes higher tariffs on things like iron and manufactured goods. He proposes a system of subsidies. He calls them bounties on other strategic industries. And he puts this before Congress, and they consider it and debate it. They actually end up rejecting most of his specific proposals, although they do raise the tariff, because Hamilton, even though he's like philosophically invested in protectionism, he's also a very practical politician, and as Secretary of the Treasury knows he needs to bring in enough revenue to fund the government. So if you raise the tariff rates too high, you actually cut off your tax revenue. And he's playing this balancing game. So he speaks protectionist rhetoric, but the bills he actually puts forth and adopts, they're more geared toward boosting the revenue into the United States.
To have a population capable of buying imports, right? I mean, you have to have some kind of middle class. I mean, what were Americans buying? I mean, I just talked to Joseph Ellis last week, and I read his book about George Washington, where George Washington didn't go to Macy's. He had to have his clothes imported. He wanted fancy clothes. You couldn't get those in the United States. They didn't really fit him when they finally made the trip across the Atlantic. He was always really angry about how he thought he was being ripped off by merchants in Europe. But anyway, so what were people like George Washington, people who had some money, buying? What kind of imports were they buying?
Yeah, so some of them are luxury goods, and I consider like high-end fancy clothing as part of that. Goods that depend on very well-developed textile mills, something that New England wasn't quite at the stage of producing yet. Then the second thing that you're getting of wealthy people that are importing, heavy machinery. And this is a common trend through the 19th century. If you want to industrialize, you need heavy machinery, but it's kind of like a chicken and the egg issue here. You can't industrialize without the machinery that actually builds the thing that you're trying to establish as an industry. And that means getting and importing a lot of that machinery from somewhere else. So if you need massive textile looms and mill parts and heavy gears and equipment that comes from iron manufacturing, you basically have to go to Britain, or you have to go to Europe to purchase that.
What were the new United States exporting in those days? Raw materials like cotton, I assume.
There's a lot of agriculture in general, because the United States is in a climate it's much more suited than Europe for food production. So especially the early 19th century, one of the major things that we start to cultivate as we move west, it's wheat and corn. It's these crops that grow really well in the United States, but they don't grow all that well in Scotland, for example. And you notice that in the early 19th century, Britain has a protectionist policy against American food products. They want to keep the farms in England producing food, even though it's much less efficient, much more costly, much shorter growing period than what the United States can do. So part of the push to liberalize trade in Great Britain, which happens in 1846, is actually to get access to the cheaper American food markets. Part of that was driven by the desire to relieve the Irish famine that was unfolding. Basically couldn't afford to feed people. So lower your tariffs, bring in American food, trade industrial goods to them in return, and everyone wins, basically.
Yeah, I was going to ask you next, when we get into the era of protectionist tariffs, there was a tariff in 1816 and then the American system of Henry Clay in 1824.
Right.
Did these protectionist tariffs actually help in developing American industry? Did they work to the desired effect?
Well, that's the claim you'll hear from J.D. Vance, and you'll hear from these NatCon types, the
National
protectionists like Orrin
Conservatives,
Cass.
they call themselves now.
Yeah, National Conservatives. Yeah. Orrin Cass and American Compass, J.D. Vance, some of these figures will all say, well, America industrialized and got wealthy in the 19th century, and we had tariffs, therefore post hoc ergo propter hoc. One must have caused the other. And yet if you dig into the evidence, it's not true at all. What actually happens is the first half of the 19th century, the United States is vacillating back and forth between high tariff and low tariff regimes.
So these are always very contested ideas.
Other than slavery, it's the most controversial issue in American politics in that era. They're going back and forth between high and low tariff schedules. Industrialization is occurring simultaneously to that. You can't say, well, only the high tariff schedules caused these industries to come into existence when roughly half the time in the first part of the 19th century, you're operating under a relatively free trade regimes. So the causality doesn't work there for the start. And then you get into the latter part of the 19th century when we did have a pretty heavily sustained high tariff regime. It turns out to be much more of a mixed bag than they claim, because if you look at the data to specific industries, you find out that although certain industrial enterprises are benefited by the high tariffs, so steel production in particular, certain textile production, these industries are also burdened in other ways by the high tariff because it impedes their importation of machinery, or it impedes their importation of raw materials. So wool, for example, at various points in the 19th century was heavily protected. So raw wool coming in, and you need that for a textile mill. Well, who pays the burden of that? It's transferred from the raw material producers to the manufacturers themselves, or vice versa, depending on the year. So it's not a clear, unambiguous win. And then the third thing you see, there are certain industries in the U.S., we think of like transportation, in the late 19th century, electrification and utilities. These are things that are not involved heavily in import competition. They're basically just strictly domestic industries based on what they are. And they're growing at a faster pace than the supposedly beneficiary protected industries that have all these tariffs in existence. Tariffs can't have caused an unprotected industry to excel at a faster pace than the protected industry. So the claim just doesn't hold up.
There's also the issue of if you protect an industry, well, now there's no competition. And often competition does bring out the best in an industry. I mean, I think right now about electric vehicles. There's been talk about placing such a high tariff on Chinese EVs that it would be impossible to sell them in the United States. And as a consumer, I'm thinking, well, what sense does that make? If American car companies aren't making good EVs, why can't I buy a Chinese one? This also goes back to deindustrialization in the 1970s when Americans wanted to buy more fuel-efficient foreign cars. We saw what happened with Detroit and the automobile industry in the United States. I'm digressing here, but why don't you pick it up from there?
So this is the major flaw with one of the arguments Alexander Hamilton puts forth back in 1791. He calls it the infant industry argument. Says our industries are facing competition from established producers abroad, therefore we need to protect them. Not indefinitely, but we protect them so they can grow up and actually enter into competition. Well, the track record is the infant industries never grow up. They remain babies forever. Take the U.S. iron and steel industry. It was one of the first beneficiaries of protection back in 1789. Here we are over 200 years later. It's still the main industry that goes to the government and asks for protection. Automobile industry, a similar thing. As you noted, when it was more heavily protected against foreign competition, cars were generally worse. They consumed more gas. They had less reliability. What happened when we opened up international trade? Well, I guess two things. First, the foreign competition improved American cars as they respond to adopt some of these new innovations. But the second thing is it turns out that trade's a lot more complicated than just a car coming over from Japan, car coming over from Korea, car coming over from Germany. A lot of these companies that are housed and based abroad, you look at the BMW plant, it's set up in South Carolina. It's providing jobs to people there. So even though it's an import technically, and it's a foreign-made manufacturer, it's actually produced, or large parts of it are produced and assembled in the United States.
In the 1980s, the Reagan administration tried to get Japan to open its markets to American manufacturers, and it didn't work out. I mean, the Reagan administration had a point that the Japanese are not playing by the rules of free trade.
You know, imagine you're in a war with another country. Would it make sense to put a blockade up against yourself just to stick it to that other country? And that's effectively what you're doing when you're adopting a tariff regime, is you're saying, okay, they're not playing fairly, so we're going to impose a blockade against ourselves and hope that that'll make them play fairly. It just doesn't add up. Now, ideally, in a good economic climate, we could convince other countries through the persuasion of argument that, yes, it's in their interest to liberalize, remove their tariff barriers as well. It doesn't always work out.
Yeah.
One of the mechanisms behind something like the WTO, several of these trade agreements, NAFTA being an example, is to actually try to draw other countries into the agreement themselves through bilateral or multilateral arrangements, bring them to the diplomatic table. So I see that as actually a much more potent tool than saying we're going to retaliate against another country by blockading ourselves.
And there's international arbitration of trade disputes as well. I don't know if Japan has since opened up its markets to our products since the 1980s. I learned about this in Nelson Lichtenstein's book that I mentioned before. By the way, have you read that yet? I think you would enjoy it.
I'll definitely take a look at that. That's
Well, he talks about neoliberalism.
Oh, yeah.
I know you don't like that term. We'll get to that a little bit later. All right, back to the 19th century, Henry Clay, the American system. There were three prongs to this. It wasn't just about tariffs. It was taking then the revenue from the tariffs to do what were called in those days internal improvements. So Southerners could then ship their cotton, a raw material, on highways or railroads or whatever, barges, to textile mills in New England, keeping it all in rather than having to ship their cotton overseas to Great Britain where it could be made into clothing.
Yeah, so this comes from a speech that Henry Clay gives in 1824. He gets up on the Senate and says, well, we've had some tariffs so far, but they aren't comprehensive enough. They aren't doing enough. We need to raise barriers against foreign competition. That'll boost our internal industries. But we also need to take revenue from the federal government, including tax revenue, but also debt finance through basically national banking, and redirect it to building roads and railroads and canals and harbors, basically industrial policy of the 19th century. And the reason to do that is import substitution. So rather than Southerners shipping their cotton abroad to be loomed and milled in England, they ship it to New England on these new roads and canals and harbor improvements that we've created for them. And he says we're trying to harmonize the economy together effectively through a central plan from the top down. Two major problems with that. First one is political. James Madison reads a copy of this speech and is aghast by it. Actually writes Henry Clay and says, I think what you're doing is unconstitutional, and it's also very risky because it's opening up the doors of Congress to lobbyists, to all these corrupt interests that are going to sway the legislation. Really kind of like saying as a friend, I'm cautioning you not to go down this route. Thomas Jefferson reads it and is even more horrified and actually drafts a resolution for the Virginia Assembly to basically declare Henry Clay's system unconstitutional. Now he dies as this controversy is playing out. It's like his last major political act was to oppose Henry Clay's American system. So there you go. You've got the internal political complication. And I'd say anyone like J.D. Vance who thinks that Henry Clay represents the true American economics, go read what Madison and Jefferson said about Henry Clay's system. You'll find out that the founding generation generally did not like it. Then you've got the second complication that comes into here is slavery.
Yes.
And Henry Clay realizes this. He says, well, wait a minute. If we are going to induce the cotton producers of the South to ship their goods only to the North and then vice versa, we trade back south to them, this is like a reinforcing mechanism for the slave economy. It's basically a federal subsidy to the plantations as well as the factories of the North. And that's going to entrench slavery forever. Clay is a slave owner, but he has moral reservations about it. So he comes up with this convoluted scheme, this third plank of the American system. You've got tariffs and internal improvements, but his third plank, he says, well, we also have to get rid of the black population. We have to wean the country off of slavery by using some of this new federal money that we've raised to ship them back to Liberia. And Clay becomes the president of the American Colonization Society basically for that reason. Yeah. It's to extract slavery physically from the United States by this really convoluted and in some elements very racist scheme of the 19th century of getting the black population out of the United States as they're freed and manumitted so we can then continue on this trajectory of harmonizing the U.S. economy. It ends up being a very strange top-down economic plan for America that people that want to adopt it today, they don't mention the slavery component because it's really kind of unsavory.
Yeah, I guess the Cato Institute does not have a Henry Clay Award. So.
Right.
So on the note about slavery, the Tariff of Abominations from 1828. So South Carolina, and this is where we get John C. Calhoun's crazy ideas that a state can nullify federal law, in this case, a tariff. The reason why Southern cotton planters opposed high tariffs, I alluded to it before, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. You know, if you have to ship your cotton to Great Britain and then the clothes are made there, if there's a very high tariff on those clothes coming back into the United States, well, then Great Britain's going to stop buying as much cotton.
You lose your market, basically.
So the tariff issue became a major sectional issue during this time as well.
There are really kind of 3 or 4 sections. So you have the mid-Atlantic states. This is where all the industrial base is. It's where the steel mills and textile mills are. They like protection. You have an element in New England that's aligned with that base, but there's also a merchant industry in New England that likes trade because they carry goods across the Atlantic. That's their bread and butter. You have the South, the plantation owners of the South, they're producing cotton and shipping it abroad. They like the trade because that's their market as well. And then the swing vote in all of this is the West. It's agriculture, so it exports as well, but it also likes internal improvements. It wants canals dug and river improvements to get there, subsidized railroads to get there. So that ends up being like the leverage tool that swings the Western states. Sometimes they end on the pro-tariff side. Other times they end on the anti-tariff side. It's basically like a lobbying free-for-all. Which goods and benefits can we offer them to lure them over to our side? And that's basically tariff politics prior to the Civil War.
In order for us to cover all of this ground, we're going to leap ahead to the 20th century now, because this is really the coda here. Smoot-Hawley. Economic thinking has come a long way since that period, the period right before the Great Depression, and even early on in the Great Depression. I just spoke to David M. Kennedy about people grasping in the darkness for answers to this economic calamity. Keynes's major work didn't come out until several years into the Great Depression. So, you know, the tools in the toolbox were very limited. But there was an idea, right, that during a tough time, it was a smart idea to put up, I mean, it wasn't just the United States. Where did this idea come from that tariffs were a good idea during an economic downturn?
It's actually out of the 19th century. It was the Henry Clay stimulus package. He thought that if you put up economic barriers...
So that's the origins of Smoot-Hawley. I didn't know that. Wow.
It absolutely is. In fact, that when they are debating Smoot-Hawley, there's a representative from New York by the name of Hamilton Fish, who's a major figure on the protectionist side, and he gets up on the floor of the House of Representatives and says, "We are enacting this bill to follow forth on the plan laid out by Henry Clay in 1824." Quoting Henry Clay and saying, "See, this is the American way to advance our economy." There's a twist here because in the 19th century, tariffs were basically the only source of federal revenue. You had a few internal excises, but under the Constitution, the original framework is tariffs are the main way you raise money. Income taxes are unconstitutional. We haven't had the 16th Amendment yet that allows Congress to do that. In that era, you basically are constrained the same way Hamilton was. You can put tariffs on certain goods for protectionist reasons, but you also have to keep them low enough on most other goods to keep the revenue stream going. Well, that goes away after 1913 when they adopt the income tax amendment. Now, revenue is unconstrained and unconnected from the tariff because you get it from a different source. So that means the protectionists run amok. And what we have is in the early 1920s, the protectionists get the majority in Congress and they pass something called the Fordney-McCumber Act. It's a new protectionist tariff, but it's also a fairly severe and extreme one. They pass this law, but it happened at a relatively prosperous time, the Roaring Twenties, so its economic harms are basically absorbed by a very strong economy. So you get to 1929, the stock market crashes. Congress looks around and says, well, we just did this tariff in 1922 and it didn't hurt us. And Henry Clay says this is the way you stimulate and protect an economy in a time of downturn. Henry C. Carey, who's this mid-19th century economist in the United States, he explicitly prescribes, he says, tariffs are the solution to the panic of 1857. So they're copying this old strategy.
This is insane.
And then and the idea here is, well, the world's going into recession. Our way to solve that is to build like Fortress America. We build up barriers around the wild fluctuations of the world market by ensuring American industries are taken care of first, and then all the lobbyists descend on the Capitol building. There are reports of bags of money being handed underneath the table to say, give me a favorable rate on toothbrushes, give me a favorable rate on window glass, all these different products. And it's a rent-seeking free-for-all, but you get this monstrosity of a bill that jacks up the tariff rate on almost everything to a point that it becomes impenetrable. And every other country abroad looks at the United States and they're like, well, if you're going to do this to us, we're going to slap a retaliatory tariff on you. And within the course of about 4 years, global trade collapses, 1/4 of its previous volume.
That's insane.
And this is at the outset of the Great Depression. It is one of the most ruinous economic policies in world history.
Now, you mentioned the Fordney-McCumber tariff. That was in 1922. Smoot-Hawley was in 1930.
Yep.
That entrenched that earlier protectionism. It seems that most historians are on the same page about this, that Smoot-Hawley was truly a disaster.
Yes, yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
And then they realized that within 4 years, it's actually one of the components of the New Deal that's not talked about as much. Cordell Hull is the Secretary of State. He comes into power, and as part of the New Deal, they passed something called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. And this empowers the president to negotiate an extraction from Smoot-Hawley, to go to other countries and say, yep, we messed up, but we're going to sign an agreement that basically negates those tariffs. And that sets everything into motion of how we get to eventually the WTO comes out of that.
You mentioned before the drop in world trade. According to the State Department's website, overall world trade declined by 66% between 1929 and 1934. That's enormous. U.S. exports to Europe fell from $2.3 billion in 29 to $784 million in 1932.
Right.
So, after the Cold War and the era of free trade, globalization, free flow of capital into and out of what were called emerging markets, deregulation of the financial industry. This is often called the neoliberal order.
Right.
That, as you mentioned, Bernie Sanders and J.D. Vance would agree on that usage. You do not like the term neoliberalism. Why is that?
Yeah, well, it's basically a pejorative junk term that was popularized on the academic left really in about the 1990s to the present. It's kind of this weird thing. You start seeing this term picked up in academic journal articles and books and saying, well, we live in a neoliberal era and have been living in a neoliberal era apparently since the end of World War II, although nobody noticed it till about 1995. So it's this neologism that's appropriated to supposedly explain several decades before that we didn't even realize. It's also extremely vaguely defined. It roughly means kind of pro-market in the different uses. I've also joked it means economics that are anywhere to the right of Stalin. But you see this term thrown out, like Donald Trump is described as a neoliberal, but so is Hillary Clinton, so is Joe Biden, so is Mitt Romney, so is Barack Obama. It applies to almost the entirety of the American political spectrum. And then you see some of the academic literature, it really goes into absurd places. Like I read an article a couple of weeks ago that claimed that the government of Iran is a neoliberal government.
I never thought of that one.
You're reading this, you're like, okay, that's just a junk term that you throw away. And I've investigated the history. So where did this word come from? And it turns out it wasn't just like invented in 1995. It was rediscovered and redeveloped. It was an old term that the Marxists developed in interwar Germany in the 1910s and 20s as kind of like this smear label for what they called the marginalist school or free market school of economics. And the idea here is that liberalism had failed in the 19th century because they see Marxism as triumphant over liberalism, and neoliberalism as an attempt of free market economics to reassert itself against Marxism. They adopt this pejorative slur, and it appears all over German language texts. But oddly, and here's kind of presaging maybe some of the trends we see today. So the Marxists are using it in the 1920s. The Nazis also start picking it up and using it because they're anti-market. So you get both the far right and the far left are attacking the economic liberals in the middle and saying, well, this notion of freedom and free exchange has been defeated by history. We need these powerful states to order our economies in such a way so that bring us either military glory or empowerment of the laborer by seizing the means of production. So you get really extreme ideologies adopt neoliberalism, and then it kind of goes underground because they're defeated both in the Cold War and the end of World War II. And then in the 1990s, it's like the left recovers this term and uses it as this retroactive explanation of everything that's happened for several decades prior. And now here we get into the late 2010s, early 2020s. The economic nationalist right has started reading some of this literature on the left, and the same thing happens. They pick up the term themselves. So now you have J.D. Vance and Sohrab Ahmari on the far right, and Bernie Sanders and like these communist professors on the far left all saying, well, the problem with the world is neoliberalism.
It has come to mean the cause of all of our ills. You mentioned the Nazis. Their relationship with capitalism and economics defies easy explanation.
Yes, it does. Yeah. Very much so.
You said they were anti-market. I guess I would agree with that. But they also, Hitler made this clear. They would protect private property. We'll save the Nazi. Yeah. I've talked enough about them recently.
Yeah, it's like protect private property unless you cross me, and then we're seizing it and giving it to somebody else.
Private property for the chosen folks, not Jewish people, obviously. And their whole point of economic policy was to drive the rearmament of the country. Businesses went along with that, even though, they caused enormous distortions in their domestic economy. Here is one definition of neoliberalism: a political and economic philosophy that emphasizes free trade, deregulation, globalization, and a reduction in government spending. Here's another: refers to market-oriented reform policies such as eliminating price controls, deregulating capital markets, lowering trade barriers, and reducing, especially through privatization and austerity, state influence on the economy. I think that one's a little bit better than the first one I offered, but I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, you hear these definitions. They're very, very generic descriptions of something I'd call free market or liberal thought. I wonder what's neo about these ideas. These are things that trace back to Adam Smith when he's writing in 1776. Adam Smith wants a reduction of trade barriers, a removal of capital controls, a loosening of government involvement in the economy. Was Adam Smith a neoliberal?
Yeah, you're right. These are not new ideas.
Exactly.
I guess you would say they're the only game in town now because post-1991, the whole so-called end of history, market economics and democracy, hand in hand, were on the march. And
in that sense, you do see elements of this term. It's really popular on the far left because it's a way to revitalize Marxist and socialist economics after they were dealt that blow by the fall of the Berlin Wall.
So in sum, in this never-ending debate about the causes of the rise of right-wing populism or Trumpism, the extent to which there are legitimate grievances on the part of white working class, the Rust Belt, who contend that globalization has not been all that great for them. In the final analysis, where do you come down in this debate? And what is your view on their proposed solutions to this problem?
So I basically come down by recognizing, yes, there are social and cultural and economic issues that are distinctive to the Rust Belt, that are distinctive to Middle America. And some of those issues have very real problems behind them. The diagnosis that's offered by the national conservatives is completely askew, completely off base. They're basically seeing real problems, exaggerating some of them on the margins, on their severity, and saying, and therefore free market philosophy is to blame. Neoliberalism is to blame. But the causal connection that they make is not any more substantive than just saying this is a scapegoat. You'll read some of the rhetoric on the national conservative right. You'd think that based on what they are saying, the past 40 years, the Republican Party has been like slashing and cutting the federal budget and eliminating massive expenditure programs. But you look at the actual data, Republicans are just as bad as Democrats at growing the size of the government. The supposed austerity that underlies their narrative never really happened. You look at their claims about trade and the loss of manufacturing. They'll say, well, manufacturing has moved abroad. And yes, it's true, specific industries have shut down and moved abroad. But American manufacturing output on the whole is actually higher today than it was at any of the time of these supposed golden years that they're calling for us to go back to. So again, it's a misdiagnosis of evidence. And then you get to the policy proposals. And this is why I'm really harsh on the policy proposals. They look around and say, well, we misdiagnosed the economic situation, but we want to plow ahead anyway and get away from free markets and neoliberalism. So what are we going to enact? Let's look around. Oh, here's a platform from 1824 by Henry Clay.
They actually are doing that, right? They actually have cited Clay. We're not just making that up.
No, they absolutely said this. They want it, and they have almost like a conspiracy version of it. They say that this was the true economics of the 19th century, but it was suppressed by free trade propaganda from Great Britain to make us subservient. And you read some of these tracts, and you're sitting there scratching your head. It's just going, what? And they have this illusion that the policies of Henry Clay were what worked, and yet here we have over a century of evidence that says at best it's ambiguous effects on industrialization. And then the very big thing, the one thing they'll never mention, is the disaster of Smoot-Hawley. It's like their version of this idealized Henry Clay America ends in 1929, right before the stock market crashes. Well, turn the page. Tell us what happened next. Tell us what happened next. And they never get into that. They just pretend as if it kind of faded away after World War II, when it actually is something that we consciously abandoned for a very good reason after World War II.
And I'll remind our listeners that I will include a link to your essay on the history of tariffs in my weekly newsletter. You can sign up at historyasithappens.com or find History As It Happens on Substack. On the next episode of History As It Happens, a story that's been swallowed up by all the breaking news of the past month. The Supreme Court's decision in Trump versus the United States. My guest will be Sean Wilentz, who calls that ruling the Dred Scott of our time. That is next as we report History As It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.